Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. I'm sitting on the edge of my bed, which I kind of regret, but I can work on my posture. Hi, my name is Connor. I like to learn. Preemptive like War Graphics, great channel. Really, every channel this guy's a host of is pretty good, in my opinion. War Graphics, Geographics, Biographics, a few more. General Winter, does winter really always favor Russia? From, like, I don't know if it was the Napoleonic Wars or World War II or both, maybe, where more soldiers were killed in the summer than in the winter because of easier spread of disease and stuff like that. Um, yeah, I think maybe it's kind of misplaced into just like the Russian winter when describing kind of, the willingness to commit to scorched earth tactics. And I get the feeling when I learn about Russia compared to other European countries or nations that they're even a bit more willing to sacrifice people at the cause of the. Let me know if I'm wrong. All right, obviously I'm not trying to lecture here. I'm just giving my ideas, but I think it's a bunch of things that the winter is just kind of highlighted and used as a bunch of. Okay, let's go. All right.
He's been called Russia's most reliable general, an old warhorse who has helped his homeland defeat some of Europe's greatest powers. General Winter, also known as General Frost, is today the stuff of legend, first personified by a British magazine during Napoleon's chaotic 1812 retreat from Moscow. He sums up everything about Russia's winter advantage on the battlefield.
That's pretty cool. I want to screenshot that. Hope you're all doing well, by the way. All right, no pause.
The biting cold and howling winds, the pre-frost sea of mud, the Arctic temperatures that have devastated powerful militaries from Napoleon's Grand Army to Hitler's Eastern forces in World War II. Yet for all its hype, is the reputation of General Winter really deserved? Do the facts bear out the idea that cold weather always confers Russia a battlefield edge? With winter fast approaching and the Ukraine war showing no signs of abating, it's now the perfect time to dig deeper into the history of conflicts and Russian climate, and what this may mean for Kiev and Moscow in 2022. When talking about what the harsh Russian winter does to enemy armies, there are two examples everyone turns to. Nazi Germany's struggles in
Hold on, sorry, I had to fix
winter
something.
does to enemy. When talking about what the harsh Russian winter does to enemy armies, there are two examples everyone turns to. Nazi Germany's struggles in Operation Barbarossa and Napoleon's notorious invasion of 1812. Of these, the latter may still constitute the most spectacular military disaster in European history. On June the 24th, 1812, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte led his Grand Army across the Niemen River as
There's an A, right?
punishment for Tsar Alexander I refusing to back his blockade of Britain. With more than 500,000 men at his disposal, Napoleon's plan was to march toward Moscow, defeat the Russians in battle, then dictate terms when they sued for peace. It was a supremely self-confident plan, but no one had any grounds to doubt that confidence. By the middle of 1812, most of mainland Europe was either under Paris's control, was ruled by French puppet leaders, or had been forced into a humiliating alliance with France. Aside from the Battle of Aspern-Essling in 1809, Napoleon himself was personally undefeated in the field. As his forces entered Imperial Russia, he had every reason to think this would be another easy win to add to his string of victories. As we future folk with our awesome hindsight know, though, that ain't what happened. Rather than engage, the Russian army under Mikhail Kutuzov retreated before Napoleon's forces, destroying villages as they went, depriving the Grand Army of sustenance and shelter. Although they did fight the Emperor at the Battle of Borodino, they then retreated again, leaving the French to march into a Moscow that had itself been put to the torch. There, Napoleon waited 5 weeks for a surrender that never came. On October the 19th, his army abandoned.
It's and so like you just have that much. It's pretty much just like, all right, you're. There was there's a name there. Sorry, a quote I think by Peter the Great. I think by Peter the Great, and I think during the 7 years, it was, and I think it encapsulates a lot of what I have learned about Russian strategy, is that they beat us today, they might beat us tomorrow, but sooner or later, we'll learn how to beat them. And I'm probably paraphrasing that, and but I think that is that Russia, because of its geography and its governmental structure, it can do stuff that other countries can't. And so it's like, all right, we lost again. Then we lost Moscow, and it's just like, all right, now the winner is just like, all right, give up. And it's just like, I'm saying like so many times, no. And then you turn around, and it's just thousands of miles of burnt, desolate, or frozen, or swampy, or muddy terrain. And I think that's okay.
And in the city, just as the first snow started to fall. What followed was a legendary catastrophe. As autumnal mud gave way to a savage winter, Napoleon's forces were devastated. Harassed by Russian troops, riddled with disease, and beset by hunger, the French-led army was in no position to survive the brutal cold. When their remnants recrossed the Niemen River on December the 14th, nearly 600,000 men who'd began the campaign had been reduced to just 120,000. It was this French collapse that led to the first known reference to General Frost in a British satirical cartoon.
What, Master Boney? Have I caught you at last? Snowball. Have I caught you at last? You can fast forward if you want. Teach you something fair. Take that and that as I relish and digest it. Bygone, Monsieur Frost, this is a much colder reception than I expected. I never experienced such a something before, such a beating before. I find I must take care of my nose as well as my toes. Yep, those are gonna be the first to go. Pray forgive me this time, and I swear by his hat, by Saint Denis, to enter your dominion again, never to enter your dominion again.
Cartoon depicting the weather as a demon trampling the Grand Army,
Northern Blast,
tormenting Napoleon. However, this wasn't the first time a foreign army.
And you got the Urals, so I don't know what that does.
Had been broken by Russian winter. The Swedes had suffered horrifically.
Oh my god, I gotta shut up.
Demon trampling the Grand Army and tormenting Napoleon. However, this wasn't the first time a foreign army had been broken by Russian winter. The Swedes had suffered horrifically from the Great Frost of 1709 during the Great Northern War, leading to their defeat that summer. Nor would it be the last such example. 129 years after Napoleon's humiliation, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise attack on the USSR, and still the largest land invasion in military history. Starting in the summer of 1941, it ultimately saw nearly 4 million Axis troops sweep across Ukraine and Belarus en route to Moscow in what was meant to be a lightning victory. Instead, the Nazis and their allies wound up getting hammered by one of General Frost's close allies, General Mud. Known as Rasputitsa in Russian, General Mud is what happens following both the autumn rains and the spring thaw on the Eastern European steppe. And it ain't pretty. With fields and forests waterlogged to the point of impassability, anywhere that's not a paved road effectively becomes a giant mud bath. It's sort of like the worst.
I wonder if it's even better to have horses than tanks in this kind of situation.
Is Glastonbury, except on steroids. While an early onset of frost meant Napoleon avoided Rasputitsa in 1812, Hitler had no such luck. In 1941, everything turned into a swamp. There are photos of German vehicles sunk and immobile in mud, of horses buried up to their chests, of men trying and failing to wade through this mud.
It's crazy how the two examples, Napoleon and then Hitler, of like they're very different technology too, and it's just beaten by the elements, like kind of just the same.
so bogged down, the Nazis lost the element of surprise. Rather than racing to Moscow, their forces crawled painfully over a landscape that seemed to personally hold a grudge against them. By the time General Frost took over, they had failed to reach the Soviet capital. While Ukraine and Belarus had been largely overrun, much of European Russia remained free, and so began a long and painful operation with the Soviets pushing back as winter devastated the German lines. Eventually, they'd have no choice but to retreat, as chaotically as Napoleon once had, a fighting retreat that would signal the ultimate collapse of the Third Reich. If Napoleon's failures had given birth to the concept of general winter, it was the Nazis' failures that cemented in the world's minds the connection between climate and Russian. Napoleon's failures had given birth to the concept of general winter. It was the Nazis' failures that cemented in the world's minds the connection between climate and Russian victory. But was this really fair? Was the brutality of Russia's winters and Western European lack of understanding of this brutality truly key to Napoleon and...
Is this a saying, or am I just imagining? Like, there's two rules that always apply, or it's like, don't print too much money and don't invade Russia in the winter. I might just...
Hitler's defeats. As this brutality truly key to Napoleon and Hitler's defeats. As we're about to see, the truth is more complex than that. Generals Frost and Mudd may have played a role in defending Moscow, but it took another officer to truly make the most of their contributions. An officer known to militaries around the world. An officer we're going to call Brigadier General Almighty F*** Up.
What?
One constant fact of the war in Ukraine is how it's been held up time and time again as final proof of whatever pet military theory someone has. The death of the tank, say, or the supremacy of drones. In most cases, these are up for debate, but there's a couple of older lessons it has certainly reinforced: the necessity of good logistics and the destructive power of hubris. In Ukraine, this took the form of Russia initially committing far too few men, giving them far too great a task, and then failing to back this up with functioning supply chains. While the bravery of Ukrainian defenders and the utility of Western weapons has played a major role, it's arguably the sheer level of Russian incompetence that's driven some of Kiev's biggest victories. Now substitute brave Ukrainian defenders and Western weapons for Generals Mudd and Frost, and you reach a similar conclusion. In both 1812 and 1941, the weather had a serious impact. But the thing that made it so serious was the hubris and poor planning of the invaders. Let's start with Operation Barbarossa. After blitzkrieging across much of Europe, Nazi high command seems to have assumed the race to Moscow would take little time. In fact, they thought it would take so little that they only packed winter gear for the post-victory occupation force, nor were they prepared for the severity of winter on the steppe. Since the...
I mean, how much more weight could it possibly be to pack the extra winter gear? Like, maybe it takes up a lot of space, or...
the late 19th century, German military academies had rarely studied wars taking place in Northern and Eastern Europe, preferring to focus on the West. And that's great if you're fighting with France, but it left a gigantic knowledge hole prior to the attack on the USSR. Simple things like the unsuitability of Western European horses to the climate or the utility of skis were not even considered. So when General Winter hit, any damage he would have done, regardless, was wildly multiplied. You can see this in the Army's communiques. On November the 30th, as it plunged to minus 45 degrees Celsius, that's minus 49 Fahrenheit, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock alerted the Chief of Staff that his men were still waiting for winter coats. Although
that's so freaking cold. What's the coldest you've ever seen? I've definitely seen it in the negative teens before. Oh.
Berlin tried to respond, supply chain issues delayed their delivery until February. That means there were 3 months in which Hitler's troops were trying to fight in clothing designed for summer. Before 1941 even ended, 100,000 men were out of action with frostbite. By the time spring arrived, the cold had caused 250,000 casualties. Even for an army 3.8 million strong, the loss of 250,000 men had a devastating effect. And it's not like they were even at full strength when General Frost showed up. Thanks to extremely dogged Soviet resistance, the Axis had suffered appalling rates of attrition. Over 730,000 casualties were logged before the first snow even fell. And it's here that we see the true value of Russian winter. as a powerful multiplier, exacerbating logistics snafus and hubris until problems that had been serious but survivable became terminal. Speaking of hubris, Luftwaffe officer Herbert Reichhoff would later identify a deadly strain of arrogance in his fellow commanders. As winter wore on, it became clear the Soviets had superior cold weather tactics, yet German officers failed to copy them since...
It doesn't sound as cool, so maybe like General Nature, like General Mother Nature? Because it's not just the winter, it's so huge, and it's not like it's slim, like it's just giant in all directions. And great, you defeat them for the first 4 battles into the country, but
Nazi ideology taught them that Slavs were an inferior race. Much better to let...
Jesus.
It became clear the Soviets had superior cold weather tactics, yet German officers failed to copy them since Nazi ideology taught them that Slavs were an inferior race. Much better to let their men suffer in proud, waterlogged Germanic boots than to equip them with dry Slavic
That doesn't make any sense, even if you think that way. You're gonna not take something that is better. It doesn't make sense, because even if you think that way, then you're still just kind of being dumb not
proud, waterlogged Germanic boots than to equip them with dry Slavic snowshoes. In 1812 too, a somewhat similar dynamic was at play. While his mind wasn't filled with guff about German Übermensch, Napoleon was certainly a guy acquainted with arrogance. In this case, the arrogance led him to do 3 foolish things. The first was to, like Hitler, not equip his men for a winter campaign, assuming Russia would be defeated quickly. The second was to...
Sorry, I have to say it before. It reminds me of the Scott versus Amundsen, trying to get to the South Pole, where like Scott is like the British Empire, but didn't use like the seal and like caribou pelt or whatever that Amundsen did, and it's kind of the same ideology of like or like man hauling versus good snow dog. It probably might have not made sense what I just said, but I had to make that comparison or else I could not listen.
Not equip his men for a winter campaign, assuming Russia would be defeated quickly. The second was to remain in the charred ruins of Moscow for 5 whole weeks, waiting for peace overtures that never came. Had the Grand Army simply gone in, sacked the city, and withdrawn, we wouldn't be here telling you about their disastrous retreat. The third was to ignore subordinates who were all like, should we take a different route back, one that might still have some food that we can eat because we're hungry? General Winter then is powerful, but not capable of defeating an army all on his own. For him to be effective, the enemy has to already be under the sway of General Fubar. And Napoleon's army was all sorts of Fubar. Like the Nazis 13 decades later, they'd suffered crazy attrition rates before the autumn rains even arrived, losing over 150,000 men in 8 weeks. So, where did the idea that bad weather was the key factor come from? That Russia in winter is invincible? Well, that's because it makes a nice story. But even a cursory glance at history shows that it's not always the case. In fact, the last century or so features multiple times when Russia went to war in winter and lost.
The Finns. What's his name? The sniper. I always forget.
So far in this video, we focused on 2 major examples of armies. He's invading Russia in cold weather. But the lessons we can draw from them are limited as far as the Ukraine war goes. No matter what Putin might like to claim following his fake referenda, no one is attacking Russia. Rather, it's Russia that's fighting on someone else's turf. Luckily, history furnishes us with a good example of Moscow attacking a smaller, weaker opponent in wintertime, even if that opponent looked very different from modern Ukraine.
Finland.
We're talking, of course, about the USSR's winter war with Finland. Launched in November of 1939,
I'm gonna go nuts. What's that sniper?
Is today a key part of Finland's national mythos. A fight for survival against a bigger, better armed opponent that ended with a Finnish victory, albeit a victory with some territorial losses. It's also a war that demonstrates General Winter's freelancing.
I heard he even, this is how much he like thought about it and was good, is that like just by the case that they see the breath, he would choose snow. This is all just stuff I've seen on, but That chills.
nature. Rather than always work for Moscow, he prefers to side with the army that's best prepared. The war started on
Pun. That was a pun.
Rather than always work for Moscow, he prefers to side with the army that's best prepared. The war started on November the 30th with a surprise attack at points along the entire Finnish-Soviet border. In the first hours, the Red Army seemed on course for an easy victory. Finland's combat capacity was a fraction of what Stalin could field. Helsinki barely had an air force, and their armor was less state-of-the-art and more cobbled together from stuff found behind the sofa. Yet, in an eerie echo of spring 2022, Moscow's easy victory soon gave way to epic disaster. Over 105 days, the USSR lost 200,000 men in combat, including the whole of the 44th Motorized Rifle Division. Hundreds of thousands more were taken out of the fight with frostbite.
I have to learn how many are in a
suffered
division.
25,000 casualties, a lot for a small nation, but a mere fraction of the losses forced onto Moscow.
Sorry, I had to pee. I washed my hands.
Nation, but a mere fraction. The Finns, meanwhile, suffered 25,000 casualties, a lot for a small nation, but a mere fraction of the losses forced onto Moscow. What's interesting is that these were two nations both used to brutal winter weather. Helsinki is only fractionally north of St. Petersburg, temperatures deep in the minuses, and days where the sun rises for only a handful of hours. These are a fact of life for people on both sides of the border. This has led some commenters to focus on Finland's geographical advantages. The high concentration of lakes that could be mined, breaking the ice and drowning Soviets trying to cross them, the dense forests through which Finnish ski troops could move like ghosts. Certainly, all this played a part, but the more decisive stuff was going on behind the scenes.
Don't they have... I feel like Canada might beat it. Doesn't Finland have like more lakes than any country? I think Canada might be number one, actually.
The simple version? All this played a part, but the more decisive stuff was going on behind the scenes. The simple version? The Finns were prepared, the Soviets were not. In a fit of delusion that sounds extremely familiar in 2022, Stalin mistakenly thought Finland's workers would greet the Soviet troops as liberators. Expecting a short campaign, he refused to do much groundwork and instead simply hurled his army across the border. That meant Soviet troops out on the front lines who had no winter training, who'd never used skis before or fought in snowshoes or knew how to construct a shelter for themselves when it's minus 24 Celsius and the ground is frozen. Meanwhile, Finland's forces
I did have a point there then, because like all of Finland is in the north area. So pretty much every Finn, just by nature, is going to have a better feel for moving around in very, very cold, snowy. So, okay, yeah.
But all expert skiers with endless months of midwinter combat training behind them. Dressed in white, they flitted through the forests in small groups, invisible against the snow, emerging to slaughter Soviet soldiers before vanishing back into that white hell. Their military theory, too, was light years ahead of Moscow. While the Soviets, like most armies, regarded lakes and rivers as obstacles, the Finnish emphasized their utility, how they could be leveraged by infantry on skis to cover greater distances and widen the battlefield. The Red Army, meanwhile, was fielding men in summer boots who were fed on a diet of bread and tea and slept in pitiful shelters. As a result, maybe 200,000 additional troops were knocked out of the fight not by Finnish snipers, but by frostbite. Others simply froze to death as they slept. Now, it's hard to untangle all the mitigating factors surrounding the Winter War. Proponents of the Russia...
Question, do you guys think it would be good to blow up, like, you know, dynamite or whatever, a lot of the bigger lakes so that, you know, you'd really have to... I don't know if a tank could go even on a perfectly frozen lake. Maybe it could. I don't know, but that would force everything to kind of go into more bottlenecks in between lakes. And did he say that and I just missed it?
Plus winter equals victory theory like to emphasize Finland's natural defenses. Finnish patriots would doubtless point to their countrymen's robust defense of the homeland. But our take remains that preparation and planning is key, that all other aspects follow on from there. Because as we're about to see, it's not like the Winter War is an exception that proves the rule. Russian losses in winter may be rare, but when they happen, they tend to happen big. Of all the things the Mongols can lay claim...
Hey, true or not, you know, that's cool.
Of all the things the Mongols can lay claim to, perhaps the most impressive is that they took on Moscow in the depths of winter and won. In January 1238,
they're
their
used
armies
to-
under Batu Khan approached Moscow, then little more than a wooden fort. By this time, the attackers had already swept through many nearby cities, razing them to the ground. The great town of Vladimir had fallen the month before. Now the Khan's armies laid siege to Russia's future capital. Within 5 days, Moscow had fallen, and the Mongol sweep westward continued. Not long after, they likewise sacked Kiev in the depths of winter. On December the 6th, 1240, the city fell to their forces and was burned to the ground and its population massacred. Of course, at this point in history, there was no such thing as Russia. Instead, the lands that we now call Western Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were mostly part of the Kievan Rus, a patchwork of states centered around Grand Kiev on the Dnieper River. So it would be a bit disingenuous for us to say that this was an
He said Dnieper. I wondered if it was Dnieper or Dnieper.
example of Russia, the nation, being successfully invaded in winter. But the point still stands that it was a successful assault on the same geographic location at a time when things were likely hella cold. At the very least, it demonstrates that winter alone isn't some magical protective force. If it was,
Well, it's not the greatest experiment because you're using a conqueror in the Mongols who, if anyone can say they have colder winters than the Russians or Finns, at least, in the West, in the European, European Russia, it's the Mongols, right? Isn't it even colder in northern Mongolia, Siberia, Lake Baikal area than it is? So, I mean, you're using an invader who's even more naturally used to the cold than the Russians or Finns are, right?
then Operation Faustschlag could never have happened. Taking place in February 1918, Operation Faustschlag was the last great triumph of the Central Powers of World War I's Eastern Front. With Russia newly under Bolshevik control, Leon Trotsky had been sent to negotiate peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Instead, it harangued and insulted the diplomats, all while playing for time to try and improve Russia's bargaining position. This had
I joke, okay? He's a historical figure. I'm trying to learn about him. I'm sorry, okay? Hello? He sort of looks like Theodore Roosevelt. That just came to my mind. Maybe it's not.
Of World War I's Eastern Front. With Russia newly under Bolshevik control, Leon Trotsky had been sent to negotiate peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Instead, it harangued and insulted the diplomats, all while playing for time to try and improve Russia's bargaining position. This had culminated with the Central Powers warning him that he either take their deal or resume fighting. To which Trotsky retorted that Russia no longer wanted peace, but neither would it fight a war. Rhetorically, it was a brilliant piece of footwork that threw all of the assembled negotiators. Practically, though, it was a disaster. Unlike the tango, war doesn't take two to make it work. Russia may have been happy to just sit on the side, ignoring their overtures, but the Central Powers were going to fight, even if the Bolsheviks refused. Beginning on February...
I watched an interview of Bertrand Russell talking about when he met Trotsky. Oh, no, it was about when he met Lenin. Never mind.
The war doesn't take two to make it work.
But I was gonna say how like he would quote the Communist Manifesto, or and some of Marx's possessive works as if someone defending a religion would kind of quote their book. But my fault. Sorry.
Practically, though, it was a disaster. Unlike the tango, war doesn't take two to make it work. Russia may have been happy to just sit on the side, ignoring their overtures, but the Central Powers were going to fight, even if the Bolsheviks refused. Beginning on February the 18th, Operation Faustschlag saw their troops roll eastward, covering 240 kilometers or nearly 150 miles in 1 week. Despite the awful weather, the lack of Russian resistance meant the Central Powers were unstoppable. By the time the Bolsheviks came rushing back to the negotiating table in early March, nearly all of modern Ukraine, Estonia, and Latvia had fallen to the Central armies, plus a huge swath of what we'd now call Belarus. The subsequent Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a humiliation for Lenin's new government. But perhaps nowhere shows how winter can both help and hinder, as during Soviet counteroffensives against a different, much later German march eastwards. In early December 1941, as Axis forces were freezing to death waiting for their winter gear, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive designed to drive the Nazis back. At first, things went relatively well. Having learned from the Winter War, the Soviet troops now had at least got cold weather gear to conduct operations in. But then General Mudd showed up in spring and everything went to hell. The Rasputitsa of 1942 saw the Soviets fighting at the end of strained supply lines. When the Mudd overwhelmed them, it effectively halted operations. Yet this setback would only be temporary. Over the next 2 years, the Red Army learned through trial and error how to fight effectively across winter. They adopted some Finnish tactics during snowfall and quickly became experts at laying long roads made of logs during the Rasputitsa, a lifeline across a sea of mud. And that maybe highlights the final lesson for dealing with brutal steppe winters.
Smart.
Flexibility. Well, maybe flexibility mixed with a bit of humility. After all, it certainly didn't hurt that the Red Army was willing to accept capitalist American trucks with excellent cross-country abilities to replace their own socialist rust buckets. At the end of all that,
Damn right.
What answers can we extract looking ahead to winter in Ukraine? And where exactly do we place the effectiveness of Russian winter? Well, as we said repeatedly, our take is that General Winter is undoubtedly effective, undoubtedly able to create problems for invaders and knock many soldiers out of combat with frostbite. Certainly, the casualty figures from Napoleon's invasion, Hitler's invasion, and the Winter War that can be attributed to cold weather are enormous. As such, it's easy to see
So
why
weird. I'd never connected it to him looking like Santa Claus. Until now. That's very strange.
Russia's winter invulnerability arose. But the key point is that these were all wars that were already going wrong, featuring armies that had entered the field with a deadly mix of overconfidence and under-preparation, and were already suffering losses. Rather than cause their defeat, General Winter simply conspired to turn that defeat into a catastrophe. How this all applies to Ukraine in the coming months remains to be seen. With the Russian army low on morale and still suffering supply and logistic problems.
True, there hasn't been a, late fall, early winter kind of fight yet.
It could be that we'll have another winter war in the making, or it could be that the mud and the snow will wind up hurting Ukraine, holding them back, stopping their advances, just as they're gaining momentum. Whatever happens in the end, though, it seems unlikely that it will be all good news for Putin. Time and again in this video, we've seen General Winter's fickle nature, his ability to help and to hinder, the way his icicles can pierce the delusions of any side in a conflict. The Russian leader may be feeling confident as the night draws in and the ground grows cold, but history shows us that one can never be too confident where General Frost is concerned. If Putin oversteps, he may just find his army is the one that suffers this winter, as so many others have done before it.
I love that host. Yeah, some people say he's too, posh speaking. I love the way he says empire. Empire. All across the British Empire. But the Spanish Empire... Okay, sorry. Oh, I'm gonna watch this too. Love y'all. Stay safe. Hope you're all doing well. If not, chin up. You'll be good soon. Emotions are fickle, my friend. See you guys next time. Bye.